It was supposed to be just another hectic night in Chicago, where the city never sleeps and the police are always on alert. Detective Ray Bradshaw was behind the wheel, his eyes tired, but his mind sharp. The patrol radio was crackling until a firm voice sounded, "Shots fired at 35th and Ashland, possible gang involvement." He accelerated, the red and blue lights reflecting off the buildings, while he imagined what he would find. When he arrived at the scene, chaos reigned. A man had been shot, onlookers were dispersing, and in the middle of the confusion stood a woman, far too calm for someone who should be in the midst of a shootout. Her name was Ebony Turner. The anonymous tip was clear. Ebony had been seen fleeing the scene with a weapon in her hand. To Ray, it sounded like a closed case, a criminal caught in the act, a bust that would earn him praise. But something didn't add up. Instead of panicking, struggling, or pleading, she simply raised her arms and said in a calm and unhurried voice, "You're making a mistake, detective." Ray ignored the discomfort that stirred inside him and handcuffed her, convinced he had just removed another dangerous element from the streets. At the police station, Ray watched Ebony through the interrogation room's glass. She remained impassive, fingers interlaced on the table, as if she were waiting for something. He had dealt with criminals of all kinds, the nervous, the aggressive, the whiners, but that calm was different. When he finally began asking questions, Ebony kept the same serene expression. "I didn't shoot anyone," she said without hesitation. "And if you take the time to investigate, you'll see that I'm not who you think I am." Ray rolled his eyes. That was what everyone said. But when he started pulling up her background, he found something unexpected. A clean record, no connection to gangs, no prior offenses, just a woman with a discreet past and a name that seemed out of place in the criminal underworld. Doubt began to settle in. Ray reviewed the security camera footage and saw Ebony running, but not chasing someone. Rather, she was fleeing. One detail bothered him. In the recording, a dark figure appeared right behind her, pointing something in her direction. "Damn," he muttered, feeling his stomach sink. The woman wasn't running because she was guilty. She was trying to survive. For the first time that night, he wondered if he had arrested the wrong person. Ray wasn't the type of cop who liked to admit he was wrong, but the knot in his throat only tightened as more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The next day, he arrived early at the station, still mulling over the security footage. He needed answers. He decided to speak with Charlotte Wilson, Ebony's lawyer, expecting to find the arrogance that defense attorneys typically have. But what he found was something different. Conviction. "You don't have a case, detective," Charlotte said, crossing her arms, "unless you want to be remembered as the guy who arrested an innocent and helped cover up something much bigger." That infuriated Ray. Who did she think she was? But when he saw the stack of documents she slid across the table, his irritation gave way to something even more unsettling, the feeling that he was meddling with something dangerous. The twist came when a new name entered the scene, Special Agent Grace Johnson from the FBI. She appeared in Ray's office with an unwavering posture, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent light. "You need to stop digging," she said bluntly, "or you're going to end up on the wrong side of this story." Ray crossed his arms, trying to hide his irritation. "And what story would that be?" Grace sighed and slid a brown envelope across his desk. Inside were photos of discreet meetings, conversations in dark alleys. Familiar names appeared there, including one that made Ray's blood run cold, Officer Miller, his own partner at the station. "Ebony isn't a criminal," Grace continued. "She's investigating the same thing as us. And you could be a key piece in taking down this network, or just another obstacle in the way." Ray felt the weight of the revelation like a punch in the stomach. Miller's name on that list made him realize he was dealing with something far deeper than a simple case of mistaken judgment. He and Miller had worked together for years, sharing bitter coffees on night shifts, swapping street stories, laughing at internal bureaucracy. Yet there was the raw, undeniable evidence that Miller was a traitor. Ray looked to Grace, his police instincts warning him not to trust the FBI blindly, but logic insisting he had no other choice. "If Ebony's on our side, why didn't she say anything?" he asked, trying to find a flaw in that narrative. Grace smiled, but it was a humorless smile. "She tried, but you didn't listen." The words hit him harder than he expected. Determined to discover the truth on his own, Ray spent the night combing through records. The deeper he dug, the more rotten things he uncovered. Miller had access to privileged information and always seemed one step ahead in the investigations into Rico Alvarado's gang. It was a dirty game. He was passing internal information to the criminals in exchange for money and influence. And Ebony? She was a problem because she was too close to the truth. Her philanthropic initiatives had served as a cover to understand how the corruption money flowed between the police and the criminals. It was now clear. The anonymous tip against her was nothing more than a desperate attempt to silence her. Ray took a deep breath. He had made a mistake, but it was still possible to fix it. The courtroom was packed, the murmurs of voices creating a constant buzz of tension. Ebony Turner, immaculate in a navy blue suit, maintained the same serenity that had troubled Ray from the very beginning. But now he understood. This wasn't coldness. It was control. Charlotte Wilson stood beside her, her gaze sharp as a blade. On the other side of the room, the prosecutor was laying out accusations based on flimsy evidence, trying to sustain the narrative that Ebony was a threat. Ray, seated in the police reserve section, felt each word like a prick on his conscience. He knew that if he had listened from the start, none of this would have happened. When it was Ray's turn to testify, the room seemed to hold its breath. He swallowed hard before walking up to the witness stand. The prosecutor guided him with predictable questions, expecting him to reinforce the accusation. But then Charlotte stood up for cross-examination. "Detective Bradshaw, in your investigation, did you find any concrete evidence linking my client to the crime?" He hesitated. He had two options: follow the script and maintain the farce, or tell the truth. Ray looked at Ebony, then at Grace, who sat in the audience with an impassive expression, and then he took a deep breath. "No," he replied, his voice firm. "In fact, there is evidence indicating that she was fleeing from the real shooter." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor tried to intervene, but the damage was done. Within minutes, the judge dismissed the charges. Ebony was free. But Ray knew that this was only the beginning. The fundraising night was supposed to be a time of celebration. Ebony Turner, now free of the charges, was organizing the event as a symbol of resistance, a reminder that she would not be silenced. The hotel ballroom was packed with business people, politicians, and community members supporting the cause. Ray watched from a discreet corner, still struggling with the guilt he carried. Even after the trial, he knew his duty was not over. Miller was still at large, and the web of corruption wouldn't unravel with a single court decision. He sensed something was amiss, and then he saw it. At the back of the ballroom, a man in a hoodie was moving suspiciously. He didn't seem interested in the event, the people, or the conversations. His focus was solely on one person, Ebony. Ray acted before he could think. He shoved guests aside and advanced, shouting, "Weapon!" just before the first shot rang out. The glass on the wall shattered, screams filled the room, and chaos ensued. Ebony was knocked down by a security guard at just the right moment, and Ray lunged at the shooter, taking him down. When he finally subdued the assailant and pulled off the hood, he recognized the face. It was one of Rico Alvarado's men. He wasn't there by chance. He was there to ensure that Ebony would never speak again. The assassination attempt at the fundraising event was the spark the FBI needed. In less than 24 hours, simultaneous operations were carried out across the city. Ray monitored everything closely, watching as agents stormed Rico Alvarado's gang hideouts and the homes of suspicious officers. Among them was Miller. The detective watched silently as his former partner was handcuffed in front of the station. Miller still tried to keep his composure, but the sweat trickling down his forehead revealed that he knew what was coming. "You don't understand, Ray," Miller said as he was loaded into the squad car. "This is bigger than you think." But Ray no longer wanted to hear excuses. For too long, he had believed he was serving justice, not realizing that some of those around him were manipulating the system for their own benefit. Rico Alvarado, on the other hand, didn't have time to say goodbye to his empire. He was found in one of his luxury homes, surrounded by his own paranoia. When agents closed in, he tried to escape through the back but was taken down before he could even take 2 steps. His hold over the city was crumbling, and with it, years of corruption were laid bare. The newspapers covered it all. Headlines screamed about bought-off cops, dangerous connections, and a rotten system that had long operated in the shadows. But something inside Ray told him that this was not the end. Taking down one big name didn't mean that the entire structure would collapse. It was just the beginning. 46 paragraphs missing. Ray hesitated before entering Ebony's foundation building. He had never apologized like this before, at least not truly. Yet there he stood, waiting at the reception while a friendly receptionist informed Ebony of his arrival. When she appeared, that same calm look, now laden with something different, met his. "Detective Bradshaw," she said, without rancor, but also without enthusiasm. Ray cleared his throat, running his hand over the back of his neck. "I was wrong about you, and there's no excuse for it." Ebony tilted her head, as if weighing his words. "But you made it right," she replied, crossing her arms. Ray let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not even sure making it right is the proper term, but I'm trying." Ebony sighed, gesturing for him to follow her to a small glass-walled office. Outside, young volunteers were organizing donations, preparing events, working for something greater. "If you really want to set things right, start here," she said, gesturing to the activity around them. "The corruption you helped expose was only the tip of the iceberg. There are more people in need of someone willing to listen before acting." Ray absorbed her words, letting their weight sink into his conscience. He had spent his life believing he was on the right side of the law, but now he understood that being a good cop wasn't just about arresting criminals, it was about ensuring that true justice was served. "Maybe I have more to learn than I ever imagined," he admitted. Ebony smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "Then I guess you're on the right path." Ray left Ebony's foundation with a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of relief, guilt, and a new clarity. He had spent years believing he knew everything about what was right and wrong, but now he understood that justice wasn't a straight line. He recalled Ebony's words, "Listen before you act." That had never been his strong suit. He had always trusted his own instincts, his training, his reports. But if that experience taught him anything, it was that the system failed when those who were supposed to protect it were more concerned with climbing the career ladder than doing what was right. Miller was proof of that, Rico Alvarado as well. But how many others were out there, using the law as a facade for their own interests? Ebony, on the other hand, wasn't interested in revenge. That impressed Ray more than he cared to admit. She didn't want to sue the police, nor did she want him to be fired or publicly humiliated. All she wanted was to continue her work, to transform the city from within, and somehow that made him feel even smaller in comparison. Because if the roles were reversed, would he have been so just? Would he have forgiven someone who had unjustly arrested him? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. From that day on, his way of working would never be the same. In the following days, the city looked different to Ray. Or perhaps it was he who had changed. The streets were still full of challenges, crime still existed, but now he saw things with a new perspective. Before, everything to him was in black and white. Guilty or innocent, right or wrong. Now he knew that reality was much more complex. Ebony's case wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a system that favored speed over truth. And if he truly wanted to change something, he'd have to start from within. That's why, a few weeks later, when he received an invitation to participate in a community policing program, he didn't hesitate. Before, he would have dismissed the idea as a waste of time. But now, he knew that being close to the people, listening to their stories, and understanding their fears was just as important as catching a criminal. At the first meeting, he found Ebony there. She smiled when she saw him, and this time there was no suspicion, only mutual respect. "I see you decided to listen before acting," she joked. Ray laughed, shaking his head. "I'm still learning." But for the first time in a long while, he felt he was on the right path. Ray had never been one to dwell on the past, but some nights forced him to revisit every detail of that investigation. Sometimes he caught himself imagining how everything could have been different if he'd asked the right questions from the start. If he had seen Ebony Turner as a person and not just as a name on a report. It was an unsettling thought, but a necessary one. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could ensure that he would never make the same mistake again. The only way forward was to learn, and he learned. He changed his approach to investigations, began to question more and assume less. Gradually, he realized that it made him a better cop. Not because he was catching more criminals, but because he was catching the right people. Instead of arresting someone just to close a case quickly, he began to ensure that every detail was analyzed, that every piece fit before making a decision. He no longer wanted to be just a good detective on paper. He wanted to be a fair detective. And perhaps, for the first time, he was succeeding. Ray's phone rang early that morning, interrupting his cold coffee and the pile of reports on his desk. On the other end of the line was Ebony. "There's a community event this afternoon, and I think it'd be good for you to show up," she said without preamble. Ray raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Is that an invitation or a summons?" Ebony laughed, and he realized it was the first time he'd truly heard her laugh. "Just an opportunity for you to see up close the impact of your choices." He had no plans for the day, so against all expectations, he said yes. When he arrived at the community center, he was greeted by a scene he never imagined he'd be part of. Children running around, volunteers organizing supplies, residents talking without that typical tension he usually saw whenever he arrived in uniform in a more vulnerable neighborhood. Ebony guided him over to a group of young people. "Everyone, this is Detective Bradshaw." She introduced him with a slight smile. "He's learning to listen before he acts." Some laughter arose, not mocking, but a friendly, gentle tease. And at that moment, Ray realized something. He was no longer just a detective trying to fix a mistake. He was a man trying to do better, to be better. In the past, Ray believed his job was simple. Catch crooks, maintain order, and move on. But now, as he walked through the community event, he realized that maintaining order didn't just mean arresting people. It meant ensuring that people had reasons not to become criminals. He noticed a boy, maybe 14 years old, helping unload boxes of food. "That's Jamal," Ebony commented beside him. "Last year he almost joined a gang, but we got him into an apprenticeship program. Now he wants to be an engineer." Ray fell silent for a moment, absorbing that information. It dawned on him. Not everyone he saw as a potential criminal was actually a threat. Many just needed a chance. He spent the rest of the afternoon talking with residents, listening to their stories, something he had never done before. The complaints were the same ones he already knew: lack of security, police abuses, constant fear. But this time, he wasn't there to defend or justify. He simply listened. And as the afternoon progressed, he realized that this simple act, listening without interrupting, without judging, was the first step toward rebuilding the trust that so many officers before him had destroyed. "So, Detective," Ebony said beside him, crossing her arms, ready to be part of the solution. Ray took a deep breath, looking around. For the first time, his answer came without hesitation. "Yes, I think I am." The days that followed were different for Ray. He returned to work with a new perspective. Previously, when he entered a neighborhood labeled troubled, his stance was rigid, his eyes always searching for the next threat. Now, he saw more than just potential suspects. He saw people. At first, his change in attitude was met with suspicion. Some residents avoided eye contact, still scarred by years of police oppression, but he persisted. He started talking more, asking questions that never would have occurred to him before, showing that he cared. And gradually, something unexpected happened. People began to respond. It was in this way that, weeks later, he received a phone call that took him by surprise. "Detective Bradshaw?" said a youthful voice on the line. "This is Jamal. I overheard some guys talking about a shipment of weapons coming to the neighborhood. I thought you should know." Ray could hardly believe it. A boy who months earlier might have turned to crime was now helping prevent it. That meant more than any arrest he had ever made. "Thanks, Jamal," he replied, feeling an unexpected pride. "You did the right thing." He hung up the phone with a discreet smile. Perhaps for the first time, he was truly changing something. Ray followed up on Jamal's tip with the attention it deserved. In the past, he might have doubted such a young source, but now he knew that trusting the community was just as important as relying on concrete evidence. He gathered his team and quietly, they set up an operation to intercept the weapons shipment. On the designated day, he watched from an unmarked car, his eyes fixed on the alley Jamal had indicated. It wasn't long before a dark van arrived, and armed men began unloading boxes. "Movement confirmed," Ray said over the radio. "Team, move in." In seconds, the area was surrounded, and the suspects were taken into custody without a single shot fired. At the end of the operation, Ray made sure to thank Jamal in person. The boy met him at the entrance of the community center, anxious. "Did it work?" he asked, a mixture of fear and hope in his voice. Ray nodded. "Thanks to you, we prevented those weapons from reaching the streets." Jamal smiled, and Ray realized how important that moment was for him. "Maybe you should think about becoming a cop," Ray joked, and Jamal laughed. "Maybe, but only if I can do it my way." Ray shook his head, laughing along. "Believe me, kid, your way is already making a difference." The successful operation reinforced something Ray had come to understand. Justice wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about empowering people so they wouldn't need it in the worst ways. He began to involve himself more in community initiatives, not as a cop trying to control situations, but as someone willing to listen and understand. Gradually, the walls of distrust between him and the community started to crumble. Ebony watched him from afar, with that analytical gaze of someone who knew that real change didn't happen overnight. But she also knew how to recognize progress when she saw it. One afternoon, while Ray was helping organize a career guidance event for young people, Ebony approached him with a coffee in hand. "I never thought I'd see the day when you'd wear one of our project t-shirts instead of your uniform," she remarked, handing him the cup. Ray laughed, looking at the print that read, "Building Tomorrow." "I can't arrest everyone, so maybe I should try to prevent them from needing to be arrested." Ebony raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Now you're really starting to understand." He took a sip of his coffee and looked around. For the first time, he felt part of something greater than his own role. Not all of Ray's colleagues viewed his transformation favorably. Within the station, there were those who respected his experience, but also those who thought he was selling out to naive idealism. Miller might have been arrested, but his mentality still lingered among many officers in the system. "Now you're holding hands with criminals," commented a veteran detective as he passed Ray in the locker room. "I heard you're spending more time at community events than catching crooks." Ray didn't take the bait. He simply closed his locker and turned around calmly. "Maybe if you listened to people, you'd have fewer people to arrest." The detective laughed, shaking his head, but offered no retort. Ray knew it would take time to change certain mindsets, but that never stopped him from trying. Ebony had already warned him about this. Change makes those who benefit from the system as it is very uncomfortable, she had once told him. Ray wasn't naive. He knew that police corruption wouldn't end with Miller's arrest, nor with the operations against Rico Alvarado's gang. But he also knew that every small victory counted. Every young person choosing a different path, every resident seeing the police as allies instead of enemies, every case resolved with justice rather than haste. These were what mattered. And if some within the force didn't accept this new approach, he was willing to pay the price. After all, if he wanted to be part of the solution, he couldn't fear those still entrenched in the problem. Ray understood that words meant nothing without actions to back them up. He could talk about change all he wanted, but the community needed to see it in practice. That's why he decided to start small. Instead of patrolling neighborhoods only when crimes occurred, he began to show up during ordinary moments, at Sunday fairs, at basketball practices in the community center, even at local meetings. At first, his presence caused discomfort. Residents averted their eyes. Conversations died as soon as he approached. He understood. The trust the police had shattered wouldn't be rebuilt with just a smile and good intentions, but he persisted. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. During one of the gym practices, a boy kicked the ball too hard, and it ended up near Ray's feet. Instead of simply returning it, he held onto it and twirled it between his fingers. "Who wants to try to steal this ball from me?" he joked. Some teenagers laughed, and one of them, tall and skinny, accepted the challenge. Within minutes, Ray found himself in the middle of the game, tripping, missing shots, and laughing along with the boys. After that, something changed. Gradually, people began to greet him first. Some even asked about his routine, about his work. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for Ray, every small opening was a victory. Even with the progress, Ray knew that trust without action was empty. People needed to see real changes, not just a cop appearing at community events. That's why he started pushing for reforms within the department. He proposed meetings with community leaders to discuss public safety in a different way. Instead of treating neighborhoods as risk zones, to treat them as areas for growth. The idea wasn't well received by everyone. Many of his superiors scoffed, and some colleagues tried to discredit him. "Are you trying to become a politician now?" a sergeant taunted during a meeting. But Ray remained unfazed. "No, I want to stop us from always cleaning up the mess after it happens." Ebony watched everything with skepticism, but also with a subtle gleam in her eyes. "You know this is going to take years, right?" she told him, after one of the tense meetings at the station. Ray nodded, knowing she was right. "I know, but someone has to start." He didn't expect to change the structure of an entire institution overnight, but he knew that small victories mattered. One of the first came when they managed to reallocate resources to crime prevention programs, offering more opportunities for young people before the streets became their only option. It wasn't the revolution Ebony had wanted, but it was a step in the right direction, and to Ray, that was enough to keep going. Months passed, and Ray began to notice small but significant changes. The number of anonymous tips increased, not out of fear, but because people began to trust that the police would truly listen. Young people like Jamal started seeing alternatives for their lives, and even some of his colleagues began to reconsider their approaches. Not everyone, of course. Some still gave him dirty looks, thinking he was wasting time with impossible ideals. But then came the day when the precinct captain called him in for a chat. "Bradshaw, I've been receiving fewer complaints of police abuse in your area lately," the captain said, leafing through some reports. "And more people are cooperating with investigations. What in the world are you doing?" Ray smiled, unhurried in his response. "Listening." The captain huffed but made no further objection. For the first time, he saw that what Ray was doing wasn't just empty idealism. It was working. "Keep it up," he said reluctantly. "But don't expect everyone in here to like it." Ray shrugged. He wasn't there to be popular. He was there to make a difference. Even though he was witnessing progress, Ray knew there was still a long road ahead. Not every problem could be solved with dialogue and goodwill. During one of his night patrols, he received a call about an ongoing robbery at a convenience store. When he arrived, he found a young man clutching a small revolver, trembling nervously, while the cashier tried to stay calm. Protocol dictated that he draw his weapon and control the situation firmly, but something in the boy's eyes made Ray hesitate. He didn't see a ruthless criminal. He saw fear. "Hey, kid," Ray said, keeping his hands visible and not approaching too closely. "It doesn't have to end like this. Listen to me, okay?" The boy looked at him, eyes wide. Perhaps he expected shouting. Perhaps he expected the situation to turn violent. But Ray simply continued speaking, unhurriedly offering an alternative. Gradually, the boy lowered his weapon. The backup team arrived and took him into custody, but Ray couldn't forget the image. In his report, he wrote what he saw: a frightened boy with no criminal record, likely driven to desperation. Later, Ebony read the case and did what she did best. She found an alternative. The boy received legal assistance, and his story became yet another example of how thin the line between crime and necessity truly was. Ray had never thought much about the impact of a single choice until that incident. Before, following protocol was enough, but now he realized that every decision he made could change a life. If he had drawn his weapon that night, if he had treated the boy as an irredeemable criminal, everything might have ended differently. It was a frightening thought, but at the same time, a powerful one. He began to wonder how many times in the past he might have acted differently if he had looked at situations with more humanity. Ebony didn't miss the opportunity to remind him of that. "Do you see now?" she said one evening as the two of them drank coffee in the community center office. "Sometimes what people need isn't punishment, but a second chance." Ray looked at her, shaking his head with a half smile. "That doesn't mean everyone is innocent, Ebony." She shrugged. "Of course not. But it means not everyone is lost." He fell silent for a moment, reflecting. The truth was, he had never thought like that before, but now he was beginning to understand what she meant. Ray never thought he would see the day when the police and the community worked side by side. To him, they had always been two separate worlds, locked in an endless cycle of mistrust. But now, sitting in a meeting with community leaders, volunteers, and even some of his more receptive uniformed colleagues, he saw something different. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still tensions, heated debates, disagreements about how things should be done. But the very fact that they were there, talking, was a victory. He remembered when he would have dismissed something like this as a waste of time. Now he saw the potential it held. Ebony was there, as always, observing everything with that analytical look of someone who knew that real change didn't happen overnight. At the end of the meeting, she approached him and handed over a sheet of paper. "What's this?" Ray asked, frowning. "A list of young people at risk of joining gangs. I thought you might want to meet them before it happens." Ray looked at the list and then at Ebony. "Do you really believe we can save them?" She offered a small smile. "The real question is, do you believe?" He was silent for a moment before folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. He might still have doubts, but one thing was certain. He was willing to try. Ray spent the next few days studying the list Ebony had given him. There were names, ages, neighborhoods, but to him, it was more than just a piece of paper. It was an opportunity to act before it was too late. He began visiting some of the young people, first discreetly, talking with their families, trying to understand their realities. For many of them, the path to crime wasn't a choice, but an inevitable consequence. The lack of opportunities, the fear, the need to survive, everything pushed them toward the same destiny. But what if someone was there to show them an alternative before it was too late? That was the question that wouldn't leave Ray's mind. Then he received an urgent call from Jamal. "Detective, one of the kids on the list, he's about to join a gang. They're going to test him tonight." Ray felt his stomach drop. Where? Jamal hesitated for a second before answering. Behind the old warehouse on 8th Avenue. Ray didn't think twice. He grabbed his car keys and left. This wasn't just another police call. It was a chance to stop another young life from being swallowed by the system. And this time, he wasn't about to fail. Ray arrived at the warehouse shortly before midnight. The place was dark and silent, but he knew it wasn't empty. He parked his car far enough away not to attract attention and proceeded on foot, staying in the shadows of nearby buildings. As he approached, he saw a group of youths surrounding a boy who couldn't have been more than 15. He recognized the name from the list, Darnell. The gang leader was handing him a revolver, murmuring something that Ray couldn't quite catch, but he knew exactly what was happening. This was a baptism. If Darnell pulled the trigger, he'd be in. If he refused, he'd be marked as a target. Ray knew he needed to act quickly, but without turning the situation into a massacre. Calmly, he stepped out of the darkness and raised his hands without drawing his weapon. "Darnell!" he called, his voice firm yet non-threatening. The boy turned around, startled, the weapon trembling in his hands. "You don't have to do this," Ray continued, stepping forward. The gang leader laughed, crossing his arms. "This isn't your business, cop. He's already made his choice." Ray looked at Darnell and saw the fear in his eyes. There's still time for a different choice. The ensuing silence felt eternal. Darnell looked around, caught between two realities. On one side, the gang, offering a false sense of belonging. On the other, Ray, a cop who, for some reason, was there unarmed, without shouting, without threats, just with words. "If you pull that trigger, there'll be no going back," Ray said, keeping his tone firm. "But if you drop that weapon now, I guarantee you a second chance." Darnell was breathing rapidly, his tense shoulders betraying his inner conflict. The other gang members jeered, pressuring him. "Show you're a man, Darnell." The leader stepped forward, arms crossed. "If you don't do it, you know what happens." For an instant, Ray feared it was too late. But then Darnell let go of the weapon. It clattered to the ground with a dry sound, and he slowly raised his hands. I don't want this," he murmured. The gang leader snarled and advanced, but Ray was faster. In a practiced move, he drew his weapon and pointed it. "Don't do it," he warned. Silence fell. The tables had turned. With the arrival of backup that Ray had discreetly called, the gang members were subdued. Darnell was taken into custody, not as a criminal, but as a boy who had nearly lost his life before it even began. Later, Ray sat across from Darnell at the station, watching him intently. The boy kept his eyes downcast. His shoulders slumped as if he wanted to disappear. Ray knew that if he followed normal protocol, Darnell would be officially recorded, processed, and pushed into a system that would hardly give him a second chance. But Ray also knew that if Darnell were treated just like another case, everything he had learned up until that point would have been for nothing. "Do you understand what happened today?" he asked in a tone devoid of threat. Darnell nodded slowly. "I almost did something irreversible." Ebony arrived minutes later, invited by Ray. When she entered the room, Darnell looked up, confused. "You don't have to go down that road," she said, sitting beside Ray. "There are other options, and we can help you if you want." The boy hesitated. For the first time, someone was talking about a real way out, not just about punishment. Ray crossed his arms and looked directly at him. "This is your chance to choose, really choose this time." Silence filled the room, but Ray saw something in Darnell's eyes, a glimmer of hope. Darnell accepted the help. With Ebony's support and her foundation, he was enrolled in a juvenile rehabilitation program, far from the gang's influences. In the early days, Ray kept his distance but monitored his progress through Ebony. "He's still adjusting," she explained one afternoon, as they organized a food donation campaign. "But he wants to change." Ray simply nodded, feeling a quiet relief. Saving a boy might not change the world, but for Darnell, it meant a new life. A few weeks later, while Ray was patrolling a neighborhood near the community center, he heard someone call his name. He turned to see Darnell, now wearing a Foundation uniform. helping unload boxes. "Hey, detective," the boy said, a little shyly. "I just wanted to thank you for not giving up on me." Ray offered a slight smile and nodded. "You made your choice, Darnell. I was just there to make sure you had one." The boy smiled before returning to his work. As Ray watched, he realized that perhaps this was the true impact of what he had been trying to do, not just preventing crimes, but giving people a chance not to commit them. Time passed, and Ray realized his life would never be the same again. He was still a police officer, still doing his job, still arresting criminals. But now he saw beyond the badge. He understood that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about prevention. That the real challenge wasn't only to arrest the wrongdoers, but to ensure fewer people chose that path. He didn't fool himself into thinking he could change the entire system, but he knew he could change some stories, and to him, that was enough to keep going. One quiet afternoon, while having coffee at Ebony's foundation, she sat next to him, crossing her arms. "So, Bradshaw, do you finally believe that people can change?" He laughed, watching the youngsters at the community center. "Not everyone, but some, yes." Ebony smiled, shaking her head. "That's already a start." And as Ray watched Jamal training in basketball with Darnell, he realized that perhaps the change wasn't just in the world around him. Perhaps it was inside him as well.